You think you know everything about the iconic spacesuits in Alien? Think again. From actors passing out inside sweltering helmets to Ridley Scott's own children wearing miniature versions, the costume design of this 1979 masterpiece hides secrets stranger than the Xenomorph itself. The Oscar-winning designer had never worked on sci-fi before. The alien's skin was covered in macaroni, and one actress's underwear sparked a controversy that still rages today. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about Alien 1979. Fact 1. Star Wars designer's first sci-fi gig. When John Mollo got the call to design costumes for Alien in 1979, he was coming off one of the biggest successes in cinema history, having just won an Academy Award for his work on Star Wars 2 years earlier. But here's the truly bizarre part. Before Star Wars, Mollo had never even seen a science fiction film in his entire life. He was a military historian and uniform expert who spent his career advising films like Stanley Kubrick's Barry Lyndon on how to make historical military costumes look authentic. When George Lucas approached him about designing costumes for a space opera, Mollo reportedly told a friend he thought the project was a sort of a space western and one of the heroes is a dustbin, referring to R2-D2. Despite having zero experience with science fiction, Mollo created some of the most iconic costumes in film history for Star Wars, drawing heavily on his expertise in Nazi helmets and World War I trench armor to create Darth Vader's menacing look. His Oscar acceptance speech in 1978 was wonderfully self-deprecating as he stood flanked by models wearing stormtrooper armor and Princess Leia's costume and told the audience that the Star Wars costumes were really not so much costumes as a bit of plumbing and general automobile engineering. After that massive success, Ridley Scott brought Mollo onto Alien, making it only his second science fiction project ever. For Alien, Mollo designed everything the Nostromo crew wore, from their worn utilitarian jumpsuits with Weyland-Yutani Corporation patches to the bulky exploration spacesuits. He brought the same military-influenced, lived-in aesthetic that made Star Wars feel so real and grounded. Mollo would go on to win a second Oscar for Gandhi in 1983. But his accidental journey into science fiction created the visual foundation for two of the most influential franchises in film history, all because a military uniform expert was willing to take on projects he knew absolutely nothing about. Fact 2. Samurai armor meets French comics. The bulky, imposing spacesuits worn by the Nostromo crew when they explore the alien planet have one of the strangest design origins in science fiction cinema, combining ancient Japanese warfare with European comic book artistry. Ridley Scott had a very specific vision for how he wanted the spacesuits to look, and his initial concept was inspired by samurai warrior armor from feudal Japan. He sketched out his ideas showing the heavy protective plating and the distinctive shoulder armor that samurai wore into battle centuries ago. But Scott didn't execute these designs himself. Instead, he handed his sketches to Jean Giraud, better known by his artist name Moebius, who was a legendary French comic book artist. Moebius had just come off working on Alejandro Jodorowsky's failed Dune project, where he had met several future Alien collaborators, including H.R. Giger and Dan O'Bannon. According to producer Walter Hill, Scott executed a full storyboard for the film, and most of the visual concepts originated with him. But for the spacesuits specifically, it was Scott's idea to adapt the design of samurai suits of armor, and he gave his initial sketch to Moebius, who then used his own personal style in interpreting Scott's concept. Moebius brought his signature heavy and bulky aesthetic to the designs, a look and style which had already featured prominently in his earlier comic book work published in the French science fiction magazine Metal Hurlant. The result was spacesuits that looked nothing like the sleek, form-fitting outfits seen in most science fiction films of the era. These suits looked old, unwieldy, industrial, and uncomfortable to wear, which was exactly the point, since the Nostromo was essentially a blue-collar commercial vessel, not a fancy exploration ship. John Mollo then took Moebius's artistic designs and figured out how to actually construct them as real, wearable costumes that actors could move around in, even if that movement was severely restricted by the bulk and weight of the final suits. Fact 3. Actors passed out like flies. The impressive-looking spacesuits that John Mollo designed for Alien turned out to be absolute nightmares for the actors who had to wear them during filming. The suits were huge, bulky, and heavily insulated, but they had one critical design flaw that nobody caught until cameras started rolling. They had absolutely no ventilation system built into them. To make matters worse, the set where they filmed the alien planet sequences was kept at 38 degrees Celsius, which is just over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, creating what actors Tom Skerritt and Veronica Cartwright later described as an unbearable situation. Cartwright gave a memorable account of just how bad conditions were during a making-of documentary called Fear of the Unknown, saying, "We were passing out like flies. I mean, it was unbelievable." She explained that the simple design flaw of having no outlet for their breath caused the already hot suits to heat up even further and nearly suffocate whoever was wearing them. The production had to keep a nurse on standby at all times with oxygen tanks ready because actors were regularly getting lightheaded and collapsing between takes. Tom Skerritt noted that he nearly passed out several times himself, and the spacesuits were essentially untested before the actors put them on, making the cast guinea pigs for the costume design. The scene where Skerritt, Cartwright, and John Hurt had to traverse the large alien landscape in full suits, walking very slowly while exploring the strange, unknown world, required enough takes that actors were consistently getting dizzy and overheated. Eventually, when even the children who were brought in as body doubles for wider shots started passing out in the suits, the production team finally made modifications to the costumes to improve airflow. But by that point, the adult actors had already suffered through days of filming in what were essentially wearable saunas. Fact 4. John Hurt's sweat-filled helmet horror. While all the actors suffered in the poorly ventilated spacesuits, John Hurt, who played Kane, had it worse than anyone else because he had to wear his costume for the longest stretches during the scenes exploring the derelict alien ship. Veronica Cartwright gave a vivid description of what Hurt went through, recalling that by the time he reached the end of a long take traversing the alien landscape, they had to have a nurse standing by with an oxygen tank because he would sweat so profusely inside the helmet that he couldn't even see. According to Cartwright, the inside of Hurt's helmet would literally become one big massive bowl of sweat as perspiration poured down his face and pooled at the bottom of the enclosed space. The combination of the hot studio lights, the 38 degrees Celsius set temperature, and the complete lack of air circulation inside the suit created conditions that were almost impossible to endure for more than short periods. Hurt could only keep the helmet on for about 15 to 20 minutes at a time before he had to take it off, and when he did remove it, his entire head would be completely soaked as if he had just stepped out of a shower. The filming schedule had to be carefully planned around these limitations, with crew members timing each take and making sure Hurt got breaks to cool down and rehydrate between shots. The medical staff on set wasn't just there as a precaution, but became an essential part of the production workflow, administering oxygen to help Hurt recover after particularly grueling sequences. Despite these torturous conditions, Hurt never complained, according to the crew members who worked with him, pushing through take after take in what must have felt like a claustrophobic nightmare, all to capture the scenes of Kane discovering the egg chamber that would become one of the most iconic moments in science fiction cinema. Fact 5. Color-coded crew members. One of the cleverest design choices that John Mollo made for the alien spacesuits was a color-coding system that helped distinguish between the 3 crew members who venture out to explore the alien planet. But this detail is so subtle that most viewers watching the film have never even noticed it. Exists. Each spacesuit was given unique colored markings that corresponded to a specific character, making it easier for the production team to keep track of who was who during filming, especially in the murky, fog-filled scenes on the planet's surface where visibility was deliberately kept low for atmospheric effect. John Hurt's Kane wore a spacesuit with yellow markings on the costume, which made sense since Kane was the executive officer and the character who would ultimately make first contact with the alien egg. Tom Skerritt's Captain Dallas wore a suit with pink markings, though some sources describe the color as red, and Veronica Cartwright's Lambert wore a suit with blue markings to distinguish her from the others. The same color coding approach was actually reused years later in the video game Alien Isolation, where the crew of the Anesidora spacecraft also wore color-coded suits, with Foster's suit being pink, Heist's suit being blue, and Meeks' suit being yellow, showing that the designers of that game paid close attention to the original film's costume details. The reason most people never notice these color differences when watching Alien is because Ridley Scott deliberately shot the planet exploration sequences in very dark, shadowy conditions with lots of fog and atmospheric haze, prioritizing mood and tension over visual clarity. The lighting in those scenes makes it nearly impossible to distinguish the color markings unless you're specifically looking for them or examining high-quality behind-the-scenes photographs where the suits are shown in better lighting conditions. Fact 6. Ridley Scott's kids wore tiny spacesuits. Ridley Scott has always been known as a visual perfectionist, and one of his most creative problem-solving moments on Alien involved recruiting his own children to help sell the massive scale of the Nostromo spaceship. The production had built an enormous set for the ship's landing legs, with the ceiling height in the studio reaching about 50 feet from floor to gantry. But when Scott walked onto the set and looked at the landing leg, he immediately felt something was wrong. He told the crew, "It's not big enough," and when they protested that the set was already 50 feet tall, Scott simply replied, "It doesn't matter, not big enough." Since they couldn't rebuild the entire set or make it any taller, Scott came up with an ingenious solution using a classic filmmaking technique called forced perspective. He had the costume department quickly make 3 cheap miniature spacesuits, small enough to fit children, and then he recruited his 2 sons, Jake and Luke, along with the cinematographer Derek Van Lint's child, to wear these scaled-down costumes. Scott positioned the children on the open elevator platform that descends alongside the landing leg, placing them incredibly far away from the camera while keeping the landing leg itself in the foreground. The result was a perfect implementation of forced perspective, where the massive size difference between the children in small suits and the adults in regular suits made those landing legs appear to be about 80 feet high instead of 50. When you watch that scene in the film, the forced perspective works so well that it's impossible to tell you're looking at children instead of full-grown actors, and the Nostromo truly does look like a massive industrial spacecraft. Sigourney Weaver later mentioned in a 2014 interview that she remembered Scott's sons being used as doubles for some of the wider shots during the spacesuit sequences. Fact 7. The impractical helmet lights. One of the most visually striking features of the spacesuits in Alien is the headlamps mounted on top of the helmets that shine directly down onto the actors' faces, creating a dramatic pool of light that illuminates their expressions even in the darkest scenes on the alien planet. This design choice looks absolutely incredible on film and has become one of the iconic visual elements of the movie, but it has one major problem from a practical standpoint. It would actually make it completely impossible for the astronauts to see anything beyond their visors. The headlamps are positioned to shine downward at the wearer's face, which means they would create an intense glare reflecting off the inside of the faceplate, especially when trying to look into the murky, fog-filled atmosphere of the planet. In reality, having a bright light shining directly into your face while wearing a reflective helmet would blind you to everything happening outside, making it one of the worst possible designs for a functional spacesuit helmet. Even the movie's own trivia page on IMDb acknowledges this issue, noting that while the headlamps on the actors' helmets are effective for creating dramatic images on film, in reality the glare would make it impossible to see beyond their visors, especially into the murk of the planet's atmosphere. However, the entry also clarifies that this is a stylistic choice made by the filmmakers and not actually a mistake or oversight. Ridley Scott and his team were fully aware that this design made no practical sense, but they chose dramatic visual impact over realism because the most important thing was making sure audiences could see the actors' faces and read their expressions during the tense exploration scenes. This kind of design philosophy, where form takes priority over function for the sake of storytelling and cinematography, became a hallmark of Scott's approach to Alien and helped create the film's unique visual identity. Fact 8. 2 different Kane suits. John Hurt's character Kane required not just one, but 2 complete full-size spacesuits during the production of Alien, and these suits had slightly different configurations that most viewers would never notice while watching the film. The costume department built both versions specifically for Hurt, with each suit designed for different scenes and purposes. Throughout the movie, the first spacesuit was the one Hurt actually wore during all the filming of the crew exploring the derelict alien spacecraft and walking around the chamber filled with the mysterious eggs. And this version had to be fully functional since Hurt needed to move around in it for extended periods during those crucial sequences. The second suit had a slightly different configuration and was never actually worn by Hurt during active filming scenes, but instead appears hanging up inside the Nostromo later in the film as a piece of set dressing. The differences between the 2 suits are subtle enough that you would need to examine them side by side to really spot the variations. But they involve things like the arrangement of certain equipment pieces, the positioning of hoses and connectors, and minor details in how the armor plating was attached. When the original Kane spacesuit was eventually sold at auction years later through Prop Store, the listing noted that the costume remained in its original film-used condition with one important exception. The backpack, the wrist guards, and the name badge on the chest that read Kane had all been replaced with painstakingly accurate replicas that were sourced from original reference materials. The fact that the production went to the trouble and expense of creating 2 complete versions of this incredibly complex and detailed costume shows just how meticulous Ridley Scott and his team were about every aspect of the film's design, even for elements that would only appear on screen for a few seconds or barely be visible at all. Fact 9. Oversized helmets for facehugger attack. The spacesuits in Alien feature helmets that are noticeably larger than what you would typically see in most science fiction films, and this wasn't an accident or a random design choice, but rather a very deliberate decision that Ridley Scott made to enable one of the most crucial and terrifying moments in the entire movie. Scott knew from the very beginning that he needed to film the facehugger creature bursting out of the alien egg and attaching itself to Kane's face, and he realized early on that this sequence would be impossible to shoot convincingly if the helmet was a normal, form-fitting size that closely matched the contours of John Hurt's head. The oversized helmet design allowed Scott and his special effects team to actually show the facehugger penetrating through the faceplate of Kane's helmet and then wrapping itself around the actor's face while the helmet was still on, creating a shocking visual that would have been technically impossible with a more realistic, tight-fitting helmet. The extra space inside the larger helmet gave the effects crew room to work with the facehugger puppet and show it breaking through the clear visor material before it makes contact with Kane's actual face underneath. This design decision also meant that when the crew brings Kane back onto the Nostromo and they have to cut the helmet off with a laser scalpel to examine him, there's enough physical space for the facehugger to be clearly visible, still attached to his face inside the helmet, which makes the whole situation even more disturbing and claustrophobic for the audience. The helmets had to be made industrial and mechanical looking anyway to match the working-class aesthetic of the Nostromo spacecraft, so the larger size actually fit perfectly with the overall design philosophy of making everything look bulky, practical, and utilitarian rather than sleek and futuristic. Fact 10. The Xenomorph's maggot head plan. H.R. Giger, the Swiss surrealist artist who designed the alien creature, had an incredibly disturbing vision for how the Xenomorph's head should look that went even further than what audiences eventually saw on screen. Giger's original design included a semi-transparent dome covering the top of the alien skull, and he wanted to take advantage of that translucent quality by filling a cavity beneath the clear carapace with live maggots so that their wriggling movement would be visible to the camera, adding an extra layer of grotesque, organic horror to the creature. The idea was that viewers would be able to see these larvae squirming around inside the alien's head, creating a nauseating visual effect that would emphasize the biomechanical nature of Giger's design and make the creature feel even more like a living, breathing nightmare. The special effects team actually went ahead and tried to implement this concept, carefully placing real maggots inside the cavity of the alien's head and preparing to film close-up shots that would showcase this disturbing detail. However, the plan ran into an unexpected problem that nobody on the production team had anticipated. When the hot studio lights were turned on to illuminate the set for filming, the maggots immediately became lethargic from the heat and essentially fell asleep, refusing to move no matter how long the cameras rolled. Without any visible movement from the maggots, the entire effect was pointless, so the idea had to be abandoned completely. Special effects supervisor Nick Alder later confirmed this story, noting that despite this failed experiment, actor Balaji Badajo, who wore the alien costume, never complained about having dead maggots stuffed into the head of his suit during those test attempts, showing remarkable patience and professionalism throughout the whole bizarre process. Fact 11, Balaji Badajo's 20-minute limit. The man inside the iconic alien costume was a 6'10" Nigerian design student named Balaji Badajo, who had absolutely no acting experience before being discovered by a casting agent in a London pub and offered the role purely because of his extraordinary height and thin build. Badajo's experience wearing the Xenomorph costume turned out to be just as physically punishing as what the actors endured in their spacesuits, particularly when it came to the alien's head, which was nearly a meter long and created an almost unbearable environment for the performer inside. In a rare interview with Cinefantastique magazine in 1979, the only interview Badajo ever gave about the film, he described just how difficult it was to wear the creature's head during filming. He explained that he could barely see what was going on around him except when he was in a stationary position while cameras were rolling, and even then, he only had a few small holes he could look through to get any sense of his surroundings. The worst part was the heat, as Badajo said it was terribly hot inside the head, and he could only keep it on for about 15 to 20 minutes at a time before he had to take it off to avoid passing out. When the head was finally removed after each take, Badajo's own head would be completely soaked with sweat, drenched as if he had been standing under a shower. Associate producer Ivor Powell sympathized with Badajo's predicament, later saying that the dreaded suit must have been pretty uncomfortable and hard for him to endure. Special effects supervisor Nick Alder, who worked closely with Badajo throughout filming, said the actor was lovely, gentle, and quiet, and remarkably never complained about the brutal conditions despite spending 4 months squeezing in and out of the tight spaces and vents of the Nostromo set, while essentially blind and overheating inside the costume. Fact 12. KY. Jelly created the slime. One of the most memorable and disgusting visual elements of the alien in the original 1979 film is the constant stream of thick, glistening saliva that drips from its mouth, giving the creature a wet, organic appearance that made it seem even more terrifying and repulsive. The special effects team needed to find a substance that could create this slimy, dripping effect while also being safe to use on the delicate latex alien costume without causing any damage to the material over the course of long shooting days. After testing various options, they settled on using copious amounts of KY jelly, the personal lubricant product that most people recognize from pharmacies and drugstores. Special effects supervisor Nick Alder explained that they had to come up with a slime that wouldn't affect the suit, and KY jelly turned out to be the perfect solution because it had exactly the right consistency and texture to look believable on camera while being completely harmless to the latex material. The production used so much KY jelly during filming that crew members and production assistants had to go out and buy up every available tube and bottle they could find in the local area around the studio, nearly creating a shortage of the product in London shops. The jelly was applied liberally, not just around the alien's mouth to simulate acidic saliva, but all over the creature's body to give it an overall wet, slimy appearance that made the Xenomorph look like it had just crawled out of some dark, damp place. This practical effect worked so well that later Alien films continued using KY jelly for the same purpose, and the technique became something of an inside joke in the special effects community. Actress Veronica Cartwright even mentioned in interviews that there was one particular crew member on set who seemed to take great pleasure in applying the jelly to the alien costume between takes. Fact 13. Ripley's controversial underwear scene. Near the end of Alien, after Ripley has escaped the doomed Nostromo and prepares to go into hypersleep on the shuttle Narcissus, there's a scene where she strips down to white underwear before putting on her spacesuit. And this brief moment has sparked debate and controversy among fans and filmmakers for over 4 decades. The scene shows Sigourney Weaver in a white tank top and briefs as she prepares for stasis. And while some viewers saw it as a moment of vulnerability that made Ripley more human after the trauma she had endured, others criticized it as unnecessary objectification of a character who had been portrayed as strong and capable throughout the rest of the film. Even James Cameron, who directed the sequel Aliens in 1986, later stated that he felt the moment stepped over the line and was uncomfortable with what he saw as the sexualization of Ripley's character. Ridley Scott had originally wanted the scene to go even further, planning to have Ripley completely nude to emphasize her vulnerability, and he also wanted to show the alien becoming sexually aroused by her body. But these ideas were ultimately scaled back. Sigourney Weaver herself has consistently defended the scene over the years, addressing the criticism directly in a 1984 interview with Films and Filming magazine, where she said that people had asked her how she could demean herself by doing a striptease, and her response was to question whether they seriously thought Ripley wouldn't take off her clothes after 5 days of blood, guts, fear, sweat, and urine. Weaver argued that the moment made perfect sense for the character and was a realistic human response to wanting to clean up and change after surviving an absolute nightmare. And she saw it as Ripley symbolically stripping away the controlling nature of the corporation that had put her in that terrible situation in the first place. Fact 14. The transparent alien dream H.R. Giger had an ambitious artistic vision for the alien costume that went far beyond what the production team was ultimately able to achieve with the technology and materials available in 1979. Giger originally wanted the alien's bodysuit to be made from semi-transparent rubber so that audiences would be able to see through parts of the creature's exterior and glimpse the muscles, veins, and internal structures underneath, creating a disturbing biomechanical effect that would blur the line between organic and artificial. This transparent quality would have emphasized Giger's signature style of combining biological and mechanical elements in ways that felt deeply unsettling and alien. However, when the English special effects technicians tried to manufacture the costume using the materials and techniques available at the time, they simply couldn't reproduce what Giger had imagined, and the latex they were using didn't provide the transparency effect he wanted. The material would deform and lose what little translucency it had during the molding and construction process, making it impossible to achieve the see-through quality that Giger envisioned. On top of these technical limitations, there was another issue that made the whole transparency concept somewhat redundant. Bolaji Badejo, the actor chosen to wear the suit, had dark skin, which meant that even if they had managed to create a semi-transparent costume, viewers wouldn't have been able to see much detail through it anyway because of the contrast between the dark latex and Badejo's skin tone. Giger later admitted in interviews that as an artist, he suffered greatly from not being able to realize his vision, but he also learned that working in the film industry requires making concessions that he would never tolerate when painting or sculpting for himself. Years later, when Giger worked on the 1995 film Species, the special effects team used pieces molded in transparent plastic formed on templates, which finally allowed him to achieve his dream of creating a creature where viewers could see through the limbs and observe the muscles and veins underneath. Fact 15. Condoms and macaroni construction. The Xenomorph costume that terrified audiences in Alien was built using some of the strangest and most unexpected materials you could possibly imagine, proving that groundbreaking special effects often come from creative problem-solving rather than expensive high-tech solutions. H.R. Giger first created a full-size sculpture of the alien using plasticine modeling clay, incorporating unusual pieces like vertebrae from snakes and cooling tubes from a Rolls-Royce automobile to give the creature its distinctive biomechanical appearance. This sculpture was then used to cast the actual latex suit that Balaji Badajo would wear during filming, but the construction process didn't stop there. The special effects team needed to add even more intricate texture and detail to the suit's surface to make it look properly alien and disturbing on camera, so they started embedding all sorts of random objects into the latex material while it was still being built up and shaped. Bottle caps were pressed into the suit to create interesting circular patterns and mechanical-looking details, while pieces of macaroni pasta were strategically placed and covered with latex to add small tubular shapes and organic-looking ridges across the creature's body. Perhaps the most bizarre material choice involved the alien's head and jaw mechanism, which was constructed separately by effects artist Carlo Rambaldi. For the ligaments and tendons that would be visible around the creature's extending inner jaw, the team used shredded condoms because the material had exactly the right translucent, stretchy, vein-like quality they needed to make those parts look like actual biological tissue. These random household items and everyday objects, when combined with Giger's artistic vision and carefully painted and finished by the effects team, transformed into one of the most convincing and terrifying movie monsters ever created, proving that you don't need expensive materials to achieve incredible results if you have talented artists who know how to use what's available. Use what's available. Use what's available. Use what's available.